The Cowboy Who Refused to Leave His Tractor by Joan Savage. Chapter 1. The Promise. Nobody in Millbrook, Texas, expected the town's most stubborn rancher to climb onto his John Deere 8R at 9 o'clock on a Tuesday morning and announce to anyone within earshot that he wasn't getting off until he'd saved his family's ranch. But then again, nobody in Millbrook had ever really expected much from Jake Turner, except hard work, silence, and the occasional scowl that could curdle fresh milk. The town fundraiser had started innocently enough. Estelle Pruitt, who ran the Millbrook Diner and had strong opinions about everything from pie crust to property taxes, had organized the annual spring benefit in the parking lot of the First Baptist Church. There were folding tables and paper plates, and Bobby McIntyre playing his guitar badly under a pecan tree. People brought casseroles and banana pudding and their best gossip. Jake Turner had shown up late, as he always did, wearing his good hat and a clean shirt that still somehow looked like it had survived a tornado. He'd bought a plate of brisket and stood near the edge of the crowd the way he always stood, just outside the circle of warmth, watching but not quite joining. Then Pastor Greer had gotten on the microphone and started talking about the hardships facing local ranchers. The drought, the debt, the way family land was disappearing piece by piece into the hands of developers from Dallas who wanted to put in another subdivision nobody asked for. And then someone, to this day nobody would admit who, shouted out Jake Turner's name. The crowd turned. Jake stood there holding his brisket plate. His jaw went tight. He was a private man, not given to public displays of anything, and the attention made him look like a horse that had just heard a rattlesnake. Turner land's been in that family 4 generations, said Hank Delray, loud enough for everyone to hear. Shame what's happened to it. Jake set down his plate very carefully. What are you going to do about it, Jake? Someone else called out. And that was when the thing happened. The thing that would be replayed on 3 major news networks, turn up on the front page of the Austin American-Statesman, and eventually rack up 47 million views on social media. Jake Turner looked out at the crowd, looked down at his boots, looked back up with the expression of a man who had just made a decision that would upend his entire life, and said, I'm going to get on my tractor and stay on it until I earn enough to pay off every cent of debt on that land. Won't step off for nothing, not until it's done. There was a moment of absolute silence. Then Hank Delray laughed. It was a good-natured laugh, the kind that said he thought Jake was being dramatic and colorful and very Texan about the whole thing. Several others joined in. Jake did not laugh. He walked to where his truck was parked, hitched to the trailer that was carrying his tractor home from a repair shop in town, unloaded the John Deere right there in the church parking lot, climbed up, and sat down. The crowd stared. Jake, said Pastor Greer carefully, service is about to start. Then y'all better go inside, Jake said. He did not move. By Sunday evening, he still had not moved. By the following Tuesday, exactly 1 week later, the story had begun to spread. And everything, for Jake Turner and for Millbrook, Texas, was about to change. Chapter 2. Day 7. By day 7, Jake Turner had developed a system. He'd rigged a small canopy to the roll bar of the tractor, using bungee cords and a tarp that had previously covered his hay bales. He had a camp cooler wedged between the seat and the wheel housing, stocked each morning by his neighbor Roy Hutchins, who was 72 years old, deeply committed to Jake's cause, and absolutely terrible at picking out snacks. 3 times now, Roy had stocked the cooler with nothing but Vienna sausages and orange-flavored crackers, and Jake was beginning to think Roy had taken some kind of personal stand against actual nutrition. The tractor sat in the field closest to County Road 14, which wasn't a main road by any stretch, but was the road that connected Millbrook proper to the Turner Ranch. Jake had driven it there on the first night, carefully, slowly, headlights on in the dark, and parked it facing east so he could watch the sunrise. That had not been a sentimental decision, he told himself. It was purely practical. The sun came up in the east. He was facing east. That was all. Came up in the east. His brother Cal had come out on day 2 and stood at the base of the tractor for 45 minutes, trying to reason with him. Jake, this is insane. I've done insane things before. Not like this. This is, Jake, there are people stopping on the road to take pictures of you. Good. Maybe they'll leave some money in that bucket. He had, in fact, placed a metal bucket at the base of the tractor with a handwritten sign that read, "Saving the Turner Ranch. Every dollar helps. God bless." The bucket had $17 in it on day 2. By day 7, it had $212, which Jake considered respectable but not sufficient, given that he owed the bank slightly over $400,000. Cal stood in the field and pinched the bridge of his nose. That's going to take you approximately 600 years. Then I'll still be sitting here. Jake. Cal. His brother looked at him for a long time. Then he looked away across the flat Texas landscape, which was dry and golden and achingly familiar, the way things are achingly familiar when you've loved them your whole life without ever quite saying so. Then Cal nodded once and walked back to his truck. He came back the next day, and the day after that. He didn't always say much. Sometimes he just sat on the tailgate of his truck, parked on the shoulder of County Road 14, and kept his brother company from a distance. Jake appreciated that more than he would ever say out loud. On day 7, a reporter from the Millbrook Gazette came out to do a story. Her name was Patty Okonkwo, and she was 24 years old and extremely enthusiastic, and she stood at the edge of the field and shouted her questions because Jake had made it clear he wasn't coming down, and she wasn't going to get a sit-down interview. Mr. Turner, how are you feeling up there? Fine. Can you elaborate on that? Still fine. What do you eat? Elaborate on that? Vienna sausages, mostly, and a deep regret about Vienna sausages. Patty wrote that down. Are you comfortable? No. Are you going to keep going? Jake looked at her with the kind of steady, weathered certainty that comes from a lifetime of doing hard things in hard weather. Miss, he said, my great-grandfather broke this land with a mule and a prayer. My grandfather kept it through the Depression. My father kept it through 2 recessions. I'm not getting off this tractor. Patty's story ran in the Gazette the next morning. Someone shared it online. Then someone else shared it. Then someone with a very large social media following shared it with the caption, "This absolute unit of a cowboy is sitting on his tractor until he saves his ranch, and honestly, I respect it so much." By the end of day 7, the bucket contained $600. A camera crew from an Austin news station was due to arrive the next morning. And Sarah Mitchell, who had driven past on County Road 14 every single day on her way home from Millbrook Elementary, finally stopped her car. Chapter 3. The Teacher and the Cowboy. She hadn't meant to stop. That was the honest truth, and Sarah Mitchell was, above most things, an honest person. She'd driven past every day that week, slowing down because you couldn't help slowing down. There was a man on a tractor in a field, and after a while your brain simply demanded an explanation. But she hadn't stopped. She had her own life. She had 22 third-graders who needed lesson plans, a leaky faucet in her kitchen, and a heart that was still doing the cautious work of putting itself back together after Marcus and the whole miserable business of last year. She did not need to involve herself in Jake Turner's tractor situation. She did not. And yet, on day 7, she found herself parked on the shoulder of County Road 14, holding a foil-covered dish of chicken and dumplings her mother had sent home with her the night before. because her mother always sent too much food, and Sarah always drove home with leftovers. And tonight, for reasons she declined to examine, she found herself walking across a sun-dried field toward a man on a John Deere. She'd met Jake Turner maybe 4 times in her life. He was older than her by 8 years and considerably less talkative, and every time she'd encountered him at community events, he'd been on the edge of the room with his hat pulled low, performing his best impression of a man who did not exist. He'd taught Sunday school once, briefly, which had baffled the entire town since he rarely spoke more than 12 consecutive words, and children required somewhat more verbal engagement. She stopped at the base of the tractor and looked up at him. He looked down at her. Base of the tractor. He had a strong face, was her first coherent thought. The kind of face that had been seasoned by outdoor work and private worry into something that wasn't handsome in any conventional way, but was deeply, unreasonably compelling. He had dark eyes and a jaw that had clearly never backed down from anything, and he was looking at her with an expression that was not unfriendly, but was definitely cautious. "Hi," she said. "Hi," he said. "I brought you chicken and dumplings." She held up the dish. "My mom made enough for a small army, and I don't have room in my fridge." He studied her. "Sarah Mitchell. You know who I am? You teach at the elementary school. You did the Christmas pageant where one of the kids cried for 45 minutes and refused to be a shepherd." "That was Kobe Henderson, and in his defense, the costume was itchy." She extended the dish. "Are you going to make me stand here holding this, or are you going to take it?" A beat. "Make me stand here holding this?" Then he reached down and took the dish, and their hands didn't quite touch, but almost. And there was something about the almost that stayed with her longer than it should have. "Thank you," he said. He meant it. She could tell. She stood there for another moment, which she hadn't planned on. The evening light was doing something extraordinary over the flat land, turning everything amber and rose and a shade of gold that belonged in a painting, and the tractor engine was off, so it was quiet except for the wind and the distant bark of a dog somewhere. "Why are you really doing this?" she asked. He was opening the foil on the dish. He stopped. "I told Patty Okonkwo from the Gazette." "I know what you told the Gazette. I read it. It was a good answer. Very quotable." She tilted her head. "But you've been on a tractor for 7 days. That's not a quote. That's something else." He looked at her for a long moment. The evening light moved across his face. Looked at her for a long moment. "My daddy died on this land," he said finally. "His daddy was born on it. You understand that kind of thing?" She thought about her grandmother's house in hill country, the way it had felt when they'd finally had to sell it, the specific grief of losing a place. "Yes," she said. "I think I do." He nodded. That was all. But something in his posture shifted just slightly, like a door that hadn't opened, but had at least acknowledged that it was, technically, a door. "Dumplings are good," he said when he'd had a bite. "Tell my mother. She'll love you forever." She picked up his empty bucket and looked in it. $600. "Not enough." "No, but it's more than yesterday." She set the bucket down. "I'll tell people at school tomorrow." "You don't have to do that." "I know." She smiled up at him, and it was the kind of smile that had an effect on him he wasn't prepared for. "See you tomorrow, Jake Turner." She walked back to her car. He watched her go. He ate every single dumpling. Chapter 4. The Tractor Goes Viral. By day 12, Jake Turner was famous. Not locally famous, not Texas famous. Actually, genuinely, internationally famous in the way that the internet occasionally elevates a perfectly ordinary person doing a perfectly extraordinary thing into a brief, blazing phenomenon that captures the imagination of millions of people who have, perhaps, been waiting without knowing it for something exactly this genuine. It started with the Austin news crew, whose segment had been funny and warm and just the right side of affectionate, presenting Jake as a lovable eccentric rather than a cautionary tale. The reporter, a polished woman named Dana Chen, who had covered 3 city council scandals and a gubernatorial race, had stood at the edge of the field in her blazer and done her level best to maintain professional composure while shouting questions at a man on a tractor. Mr. Turner, are you aware that you've become something of a celebrity? No. You are, though. Thousands of people have been sharing your story online. Huh. Does that affect your decision to remain on the tractor? Jake had thought about it. Nope. Dana Chen had turned back to the camera with an expression that suggested she was personally delighted by this assignment. Someone clipped the segment and posted it with the caption, "The internet's boyfriend has been found, and he lives on a tractor in Texas." It got 2 million views overnight. The next morning, there were 16 people parked on County Road 14. By the end of the week, there were gift shops. Well, one gift shop. It was Hank Delray's hardware store, which had quickly pivoted to selling unofficial merchandise after Hank's daughter Melissa, who had a good head for business and a cricket machine, spent one inspired Saturday night creating Team Turner bumper stickers and coffee mugs with Jake's face on them. She couldn't print them fast enough. She ran out of sticker paper twice. The bucket, now replaced with a proper collection box that Roy Hutchins had built from scrap wood and painted green to match the tractor, was receiving cash donations daily. But more significantly, a GoFundMe that Patty Okonkwo had set up on a whim had gone viral alongside the news segment and was climbing with dizzying speed. 20,000, 50,000, 90,000. Jake did not have a smartphone and had to be informed of these developments by Cal, who drove out each morning with updates delivered in the careful tone of someone conveying news that was technically good, but somehow also deeply unsettling. $112,000, Cal said on day 15, standing by the truck. Jake was quiet. As of this morning, Cal added, more quiet. Jake, I heard you. 112,000? I heard you, Cal. Jake looked out over his land. The morning was pale and cool, the way Texas mornings sometimes are before the heat remembers its job. A red-tailed hawk was doing slow circles over the far field. That's good. It's real good. It's not 400,000. No, but it's not nothing. Jake nodded. He thought about his father. He thought about the way his father used to stand at the edge of this same field at this same hour and just breathe it in, like the air out here had something in it that the air everywhere else didn't. It probably had dust and pollen and hay chaff, if you were being scientific about it. But Jake had never been interested in being scientific about that. The tourists were, at this point, simply a fact of life. They arrived in cars and minivans, and occasionally in a rented RV from Austin, and they took pictures and left donations and asked Roy Hutchins, who had unofficially positioned himself as a kind of visitor coordinator, questions about Jake's background and the history of the ranch. Roy told them everything he knew, which was considerable, and several things he wasn't entirely sure about, which he told anyway with complete confidence. Has he always been this stubborn? A woman from Houston asked Roy one afternoon. Roy considered it. I knew him when he was 8 years old, and he got his boot stuck in a fence post and sat there for 4 hours rather than holler for help. So yes. The woman wrote that down. One of the videos that spread farthest was shot by a 13-year-old boy from Amarillo who was visiting with his family. He'd caught the moment when a nationally known country music star, who happened to be passing through on a tour bus and had heard about the situation from his band members, had stopped and climbed out specifically to shake Jake's hand. Jake had looked at the man with polite confusion and said, "You want to take a picture?" The country star had said yes, and in the resulting photo, You could see Jake's bewilderment and the country star's enormous grin, and the caption the boy put on it was, "When the celebrity is more starstruck than the regular person," and that video got 11 million views. None of this would have kept Jake together, though. Not really. That was Sarah's job. Though she wouldn't have put it that way. She was just bringing dinner. Chapter 5. A Town Falls in Love with the Story. Millbrook, Texas had a population of 4,322 people, a water tower with a faded longhorn painted on it, a diner that served the best chicken fried steak in 100 miles, and a deep communal instinct for looking after its own. The town had watched Jake Turner's situation with the particular mix of amusement, affection, and territorial pride that small communities reserve for their most singular residents. He was their stubborn rancher, their ridiculous, extraordinary, quietly heartbreaking cowboy on a tractor. And as the days became weeks and the weeks began to accumulate, something shifted in the way Millbrook related to Jake Turner's vigil. It stopped being a joke. Not that it had ever been entirely a joke, but there had been a phase, roughly the first 2 weeks, during which Millbrook's reaction was primarily one of fond disbelief. People shook their heads and laughed and said things like, "That is so Jake," with the resigned warmth you apply to someone you love who has always been impossible. But then something happened around day 18. Loretta Finch, who was 81 years old, had taught 3rd grade at Millbrook Elementary for 37 years before retiring, and had known Jake Turner since he was a gap-toothed kid who could barely read but could already ride better than most adults, drove out to County Road 14 in her old Buick and parked in the grass. She walked out to the tractor, slowly because her hip wasn't what it once was, and stood at the base of it and looked up at Jake. "Your mother would be real proud of you," she said. Jake's throat moved. He said nothing. Loretta nodded once, turned around, and walked back to her car. That evening, 3 of the other retired teachers from Millbrook Elementary drove out and did the same thing. They didn't all say things. One of them just patted the rear tire of the tractor. But the message was received. By week 3, there was an informal schedule. Mornings, Roy Hutchins brought supplies. Midday, whichever of the farming families from the surrounding land was available, swung by with updates on weather and cattle and the general agricultural situation. Afternoons, younger folks from town often stopped to say hello and leave donations and take a picture that was only a little bit for social media, and mostly because they wanted to remember this. And evenings? Evenings were Sarah. To remember this. She came every night. She told herself, initially, that she was varying it up, that sometimes she'd come, and sometimes she wouldn't, that she had a life and a faucet that still needed fixing, and 22 3rd graders who needed her. But somehow, she always ended up on County Road 14 as the sun got low. Sometimes she brought food. Sometimes she brought news from the school, or the diner, or whatever had happened that day in Millbrook. Sometimes she just sat on the hood of her car and talked at Jake in his tractor seat, and he listened the way he listened to everything, with his whole attention, completely still, like listening was something you did with your body. The town noticed. Of course the town noticed. Millbrook noticed everything. It was the primary industry, in the absence of much else. Estelle Pruitt noticed first. "That young woman drives out there every single evening," she reported to whoever was at the counter of the diner the next morning. "She's being kind," said someone. "She's being more than kind," said Estelle, with the tone of a woman who had seen a great many things and knew the difference. Patty Okonkwo from the Gazette noticed and wrote a follow-up piece that was careful and tasteful about it, describing Sarah as the quiet heart of the community's support for the Turner Ranch effort, and mentioning that the school's fundraising efforts, organized by Sarah, had contributed nearly $8,000 to the GoFundMe. The national media noticed too, eventually. A lifestyle magazine ran a feature with the headline, "The Teacher Who Brings Him Dinner Every Night," and included a photo taken from County Road 14, 200 yards away, of Sarah's car parked on the shoulder, and two figures, one in a tractor seat, one standing below, silhouetted against a Texas sunset that looked, if you were being honest, almost criminally beautiful. 48,000 people shared that photo with some variation of the caption, "I am not okay." Sarah found out about the photo when one of her students held up a printed copy of it in class and said, "Miss Mitchell, my mom says you're in love with the tractor man." Sarah set down her dry erase marker very carefully. "We are going to talk about the water cycle now," she said. Chapter 6. Feelings Grow. She brought him peach cobbler on day 23. It was her own recipe, and she didn't make it often because it required actual effort, and she was someone who existed in a permanent negotiation between the ambition of her cooking and the reality of her schedule. But she'd made it on Sunday afternoon with the windows open and the radio on and a deliberately blank mind, and when it came out of the oven, it was perfect, bubbling and golden and fragrant in a way that made her feel, briefly, that everything was fine. She brought it out in the early evening as the light was going sideways and gold across the land. Jake accepted it and looked at it for a moment with an expression she was beginning to understand, which was the expression of a man who was surprised by kindness even when he'd been receiving it consistently for over 3 weeks. Like each instance was its own small shock. "You made this," he said. "Yes." "From scratch? What other kind is there?" He looked at her. "I haven't had homemade peach cobbler since my mother." She hadn't known that. She didn't know how to respond to it, so she sat on the hood of her car the way she usually did, and looked out across the land, and said, "Tell me about her." And he did. For the better part of an hour, while the Texas evening performed one of its extraordinary sunset routines in the western sky, Jake Turner talked about his mother. Her name had been Eleanor. She'd been from East Texas originally, had met Jake's father at a rodeo in Tyler when she was 19, and had spent 40 years making this land her life. She'd grown a garden that could have supplied a small grocery store. She'd been the one who taught both Jake and Cal to cook, to sew a fence line, to read a weather sky. She'd died 6 years ago, and the ranch had started going wrong not long after, and Jake had never fully unpacked whether those two events were connected or whether it was just the way things went. Sarah listened to all of it. She was a good listener. Her students knew it, the way kids always know which adults are genuinely paying attention. And she listened to Jake the way she listened to her kids, with her whole self. When he finished, she said quietly, "She sounds like the kind of person who would absolutely approve of what you're doing." "Think so?" "I think so. A beat. I also think she'd tell you to eat more vegetables because Roy Hutchins has apparently decided you can survive on processed meat products." He laughed. It was a real laugh, short and surprised and genuine, and it did something to her that she was not prepared for. She had not heard him laugh before. It changed his face entirely, opened it up, made him look younger and less burdened, and, honestly, if she was being completely honest, which she tried always to be, it made her chest do something inconvenient. She told herself it was the peach cobbler. The fumes were obviously getting to her. Over the following days, the conversations deepened. She found out he'd played high school football badly, loved old westerns, had once tried to read War and Peace, and made it 40 pages in before giving up without a shred of guilt. He'd never been married, had come close once in his 30s with a woman named Linda, who decided she wanted to live in the city and had not been close since. Linda, who He didn't talk about Linda with any particular bitterness. He talked about it the way he talked about the drought, as a difficult thing that had happened, that he'd weathered, that had left its mark. He found out about Marcus. Not all of it, but enough. That there had been someone, that it had ended, that Sarah had spent some time after that being someone she didn't quite recognize, someone who waited for the other shoe to drop instead of dancing. "You don't seem like someone who waits for things to go wrong," he said one evening. "I used to not be." She was looking at her hands in the fading light. "I'm getting back to that. It takes a while." "Yeah," he said, "it does." They sat in the easy quiet for a moment. "You know what I think about up here sometimes?" he said. "Tell me. Whether I'm doing this for the right reasons. Whether this is—" He stopped. Chose his words with the deliberate care of a man who had a small supply of them and chose to spend them carefully. Whether I'm actually fighting for the ranch, or whether I'm just afraid of what happens when I have to start over. She looked up at him. The last of the light was behind him, and she couldn't quite see his expression. "I think," she said slowly, "that the answer to that can be both. People fight for things they love and are scared to lose at the same time. That doesn't make the love less real." A long pause. "You're pretty smart for a third-grade teacher," he said. "My kids are very sophisticated. We've moved on from the water cycle. We're doing plate tectonics." He smiled. She could see it even in the near dark. She drove home with the windows down and the radio off and tried to have a straightforward and rational think about what was happening. It didn't go particularly well. Chapter 7. The Offer That Changes Everything. On day 31, a man in a very expensive truck arrived on County Road 14. His name was Preston Hale, and he was the kind of man who had never in his life driven a 30-year-old F-150 or worried about where next month's mortgage was coming from, and he wore his certainty like a second shirt. He represented a development company out of Dallas. He had a card, business weight with embossed lettering, and he held it out to Cal Turner, where Cal was parked on the shoulder. Cal looked at the card. He looked at the man. "You want to talk to Jake?" he said. "Not me." "I heard he's not coming down." "That's correct." Preston Hale looked at the tractor in the field for a long moment. He was a practical man. He adjusted. He cupped his hands around his mouth and shouted across the field, "Mr. Turner, Preston Hale, Hale Development. I'd like to make you an offer." "Mr. Turner." Jake did not look up from what he was doing, which was repairing a length of fence line along the field edge, a task he'd been chipping at from the tractor because he'd figured out he could maneuver close enough to reach. It was a testament to both his ingenuity and his absolutely ironclad commitment to his own promise. "Not interested," Jake shouted back. "You haven't heard the offer." "Don't need to." Preston Hale was not accustomed to being turned down at this stage of a conversation. He squared his shoulders and walked out into the field, which ruined his shoes somewhat. He stopped at a distance that allowed him to speak without shouting quite so loudly. "Mr. Turner, I'll buy your land at 120% of assessed value. Cash. You'll clear enough to pay off your debts and have money left over. You can start fresh somewhere else." Jake looked at him now. The full, still, weighing look of a man who was not stupid and was not impulsive. "Fresh somewhere else," Jake said. "That's right. This land belonged to my great-grandfather. I understand that, and I respect it, but sometimes my grandfather was born in the house at the top of that ridge." Jake pointed. You could just see the roofline from here, old and silver-weathered and completely indomitable. "My father is buried in the family plot on the south end of the property. My mother is buried next to him." Preston Hale said nothing. You understand what you're asking me to start fresh from? Jake said. A long pause. The wind moved through the dry grass. Somewhere down the road, a car passed. My offer stands, Preston Hale said finally, because he was, at the end of everything, a man who had only one way of understanding value. And my answer stands, said Jake. Preston Hale walked back to his truck with ruined shoes and drove away. Cal had watched the whole thing from the shoulder. Ruined shoes and drove away. When Preston Hale's truck disappeared around the bend, he looked at his brother on the tractor and felt something shift in his chest. A complicated, proud, almost painful thing. The GoFundMe was at $240,000. It was also the day Sarah arrived to find Jake quiet, in a way that was different from his usual quiet. He took the food she brought, beef stew and cornbread, from the diner, because Estelle had started sending things with Sarah without being asked, and he set it aside without eating. A man came today, he said. She'd heard. Roy had texted her with extraordinary speed for a 72-year-old. I know. He wasn't wrong about the math. She waited. He just didn't understand what the math was for, Jake said. He looked out at the ridge where the house stood. I'm not saving money. I'm saving... He stopped. You know what I'm saving? Yes, she said. I do. Something in the way she said it made him look at her differently. I do. Or maybe he'd been looking at her differently for some time and was only now admitting it to himself. The evening was warm and still and smelled like dry earth and coming summer, and she was standing below him in the golden hour light in a yellow dress she'd worn to a parent-teacher conference that day, and she was looking up at him with an expression he recognized because he felt it too. He almost said something. He almost said several things. Instead, he said, Roy told me you organized another fundraiser at the school. The kids did most of it, she said, and her voice was only slightly less steady than usual. They made drawings of the ranch and sold them. Kobe Henderson made $12. That kid who wouldn't be a shepherd. He contains multitudes. Jake almost smiled. Not quite. He was still looking at her with that weighted, careful look. Sarah, he said. Jake. And then neither of them said anything, and the moment held itself for a long beat before Sarah looked away and said something about the stew getting cold, and the evening moved on, but the space where those words hadn't been said remained between them, present and specific and impossible to ignore. She drove home later than usual. She sat in her car in front of her house for a while before going inside. Her faucet was still dripping. Chapter 8. The Woman He Can't Lose. On day 38, something happened that Jake hadn't anticipated. He'd anticipated a lot. He'd anticipated discomfort and boredom and the slow, cruel arithmetic of waiting. He'd anticipated public attention and tourist traffic and Roy Hutchins' unyielding commitment to a Vienna sausage-based diet. He'd anticipated the bank being patient or impatient, the GoFundMe climbing or stalling, the weather turning or holding. He had not anticipated that one of the journalists from a national outlet would track down Sarah. He had not anticipated. Her name was Veronica Slade, and she had a television show about human interest stories and a following of 2 million people, and a very good instinct for the real story inside a story. She'd found out about Sarah through the magazine photo. She'd found out which school Sarah taught at through simple research. And she'd shown up at Millbrook Elementary on a Thursday afternoon with a camera crew and a very warm smile. Sarah had spoken to her briefly in the school parking lot, politely, and had said only what she felt comfortable saying. That she was a member of the community, that she supported Jake as she supported all of Millbrook, and that Jake's commitment to his family's land was something worth honoring. This was all completely true. it was also incomplete. Veronica Slade was too good at her job not to notice. The segment that ran the following week was not unkind to notice. It was actually lovely. A portrait of the town's support for Jake, which included footage of the donation collection and interviews with Roy and Estelle and Patty and several of Jake's farming neighbors. It included the photo, which Veronica described as perhaps the most beautiful image of loyalty that this correspondent has encountered in 20 years of storytelling. And then Veronica looked directly into the camera and said, "The woman in that photo hasn't confirmed the nature of her relationship with Jake Turner. But Millbrook, Texas seems to know. And watching them together in the evenings, at a distance," the footage cut to more of the silhouette image. One finds oneself hoping, very much, that this particular story has the ending it seems to be building toward. 47 million people watched that segment. Jake found out about it from Cal the next morning. Watched that segment. He thought about it for a long time in the particular way he thought about things, which was without speaking, looking at the middle distance, while Cal stood by the truck and waited. "She said she supports me as part of the community," Jake said finally. "She said more than that with her face," Cal said. "I watched it. She looked..." He paused. "She looked like someone who's trying very hard to say less than she means." Jake said nothing. "Jake, you know how you feel. I'm on a tractor." "I am aware. I've been on a tractor for 38 days. I can't exactly..." He stopped. "I can't offer her anything right now. I can't take her to dinner. I can't... I'm on a tractor, Cal." Cal looked at his brother with the patient, exasperated, deeply loving expression of someone who had been watching this man navigate around his own feelings for 38 years. "You think she doesn't know that? You think that's why she comes out here every single night?" Jake was quiet. "That's why she comes out here. She's not coming for the Vienna sausages, brother." That evening, Sarah came later than usual. Jake had been watching the road. He told himself he was watching for Roy, who was late with the evening supply run. He was watching for Sarah. When her headlights appeared on County Road 14 and she pulled over and walked across the field, he noticed she was walking more carefully than usual, like someone carrying something fragile. She brought soup from the diner and a piece of lemon cake from the bakery that had opened last year next to Hank's Hardware. She handed things up to him and then stood with her hands in her jacket pockets, looking out at the land. "I heard about the segment," she said. "Yeah. I want you to know I didn't say anything that..." "I know," he said. "I know you didn't." A pause. "It's strange," she said. "Having people watch something they don't fully understand and tell you what it means." He looked at her for a long time. "What does it mean?" he asked quietly. "Time. To you." She was quiet for a moment that felt geological in scale. "I think," she said very carefully, "that I should let you focus on what you came out here to do." "Sarah?" "You're close," she said. "The GoFundMe is at $280. You're getting there. You should focus on..." "Sarah." His voice was low and firm. "You have never let me avoid a question. Don't start now." She looked up at him. In the dark, her eyes were bright. "I think," she said softer, "that I drive out here every evening because you're the most honest person I've met in a long time. And I think somewhere along the way I stopped coming because of the community and started coming because of you. And I think..." She stopped, pressed her lips together. "I think that terrifies me a little, given my recent history with deciding to trust people." Jake was very still. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. "In the literal sense, obviously, but also in the..." He exhaled. "I don't know how to say this smoothly." "I'm not a smooth man. I know. I'm on a tractor." I'm aware, Jake. But when I get off it, he said, I would very much like to take you to dinner. At an actual table, indoors, if that's something you want. The pause that followed lasted approximately forever. Yes, she said. That is something I want. He exhaled like he'd been holding that breath for 38 days. She smiled up at him, and the smile was something he was going to be thinking about for a long time. Now eat your lemon cake, she said, before it gets weird. He did. Chapter 9, Climbing Down. On day 44, the GoFundMe crossed $400,000. It happened on a Tuesday morning, while Jake was watching the sunrise, and it was Roy Hutchins who ran across the field, at a pace that was genuinely alarming for a 72-year-old man, waving his phone and trying to simultaneously shout and breathe, which worked out for neither endeavor. Jake! Jake! It happened! Neither endeavor. It crossed, Roy gasped. It crossed 400! You're done! It's done! Jake looked at the phone Roy was holding up. The number was there, undeniable, climbing still because people were continuing to donate even now. He looked at it for a long time. Then he looked at the land. He'd been up here long enough to have watched it through a full cycle of mornings, every shade of sunrise this particular field could produce. He'd watched it through 3 rainstorms and a stretch of wind that had tested the structural integrity of his canopy. He'd watched the neighboring fields get worked and the cattle make their slow circuits, and the hawk that had claimed the territory above the far field conduct its daily patrol. He knew this land differently now. Not more than before, because he'd known it his whole life. But differently, more consciously, with gratitude in it, which grief had crowded out for a while. He called the bank from Roy's phone. The conversation was brief and businesslike, and at the end of it, he had a wire transfer number and a scheduled appointment for the following day. Then he called Sarah. She picked up on the second ring. She was at school. He could hear the distant texture of elementary school in the background, the particular acoustic signature of children existing in large numbers. It crossed, he said. A pause. Then, Jake. Yeah. Oh, Jake. Her voice did something he felt in his chest. Are you going to? Tomorrow morning, he said. After I call the bank. He paused. I thought you should know first. The silence on her end had a warmth to it. I'll be there, she said. He hadn't asked her to be. He would have, but she'd said it before he could. He added that to the list of things he wanted to remember about this, or he could. He told Roy, who immediately called Estelle, who immediately called approximately everyone in Millbrook, so that by the time the school day ended and people began getting off work and the evening gathered itself together, there were cars lining both sides of County Road 14 for a quarter mile. Patty Okonkwo was there with her camera. The Austin news crew had driven back out. 2 vans from national outlets were parked along the road. Social media had already picked up the murmurs that something was going to happen tomorrow morning. But the evening itself was quiet. Sarah came, as she always did, and brought food from the diner. She and Jake talked for a long time, not about anything in particular. About his plans for the ranch, about the summer reading program she was putting together for the school, about whether he thought it would rain before the end of June. Easy things, familiar things, the kinds of things you say when you know there will be time for everything else. You nervous? When you know there will be time. She asked at one point. About what? Getting off the tractor. It's been a while. He considered. My legs might not work. Roy will catch you. Roy is 72. Roy is in remarkable shape for 72. He ran across that field this morning like a man 40 years younger. He really did. She smiled. He watched her smile. I'll be there. she said again, softly, when she was leaving. In the morning. I know, he said. Thank you. It was not enough words for what he meant. He thought she understood anyway. He sat on the tractor that night for a long time after the last car left, in the dark and the quiet, with the stars doing their usual extravagant display above the Texas flatland. He thought about his great-grandfather, who had broken this land. His grandfather, who had been born here. His father, who was buried here. His mother, whose garden would need tending. He thought about what it meant to continue something. To decide that a thing mattered enough to be unreasonable about it in front of everyone for 44 days, until the math finally moved in your direction. He thought about Sarah. He thought the ranch and Sarah were the same kind of thing, worth being unreasonable about. He decided to do something about that tomorrow, too. The sunrise, when it came, was spectacular. He hadn't expected anything less. By 8 in the morning, there were over 300 people gathered along County Road 14 and in the field. The news vans had their cameras up. Roy was already in position, vibrating with excitement. Cal stood near the front, arms crossed, trying to look composed and failing. And Sarah was there, in the front, close to the tractor, in a blue sweater and her dark hair in the wind. And when Jake looked down and found her face in the crowd, she looked back at him steadily, the way she always did, in the crowd. He put the tractor in gear and drove it, very slowly and with great dignity, back toward the barn where it properly belonged. Then he climbed down. His legs were fine. They held. The noise was enormous. 300 people cheering, car horns on County Road 14. Roy absolutely losing his composure and just crying without any apparent concern about it. Cal was clapping slowly, shaking his head, the smile on his face enormous and helpless. Jake stood on the ground and felt it under his boots and breathed. Then he walked toward Sarah. Chapter 10. The life worth fighting. For he stopped in front of her. She looked up at him. He was taller than you registered when he was on the tractor, and she was suddenly aware of the crowd around them and the cameras and the entire world watching, and she didn't care about any of it. Hi, she said. Hi, he said. How are your legs? Fine. A beat. How's your faucet? She blinked. It's still dripping. The faucet. How do you know about my... You mentioned it. Week 2. She stared at him. I've been paying attention, he said, with the quiet certainty of a man stating a fact. For a while now. The crowd had gotten somewhat quieter in the way crowds do when they sense something happening that is more significant than entertainment. Jake, she said carefully. I know this is probably not the right setting, he said. He glanced briefly at the news cameras and then looked back at her with an expression that said he had elected to simply not be worried about them. But I've been sitting up on that tractor for 44 days, and I have had a lot of time to think. I'm aware, and I have thought about a lot of things. He reached out and took her hand, which he'd never done before, and the contact was warm and solid and very steady. But mostly, I've thought about how every single day, you were the thing I was waiting for. Somewhere in the crowd, someone said, "Oh my God," audibly. You didn't have to come, he said. Nobody asked you to, and you came every day. You brought food, and you listened, and you asked the questions nobody else asked, and you made me feel like... He stopped. Chose again. Like the tractor wasn't just a crazy thing I was doing. Like it made sense. You made it make sense. Her eyes were doing something she would later describe as a completely involuntary malfunction. I meant what I said, he continued, about dinner, at a table. But I also mean, Beyond that, I'm not good at big speeches. I'm better at showing up and doing the work. I'd like to do that. For you." She looked at him for a moment. "Jake Turner," she said, "you have been sitting on a tractor for 44 days in front of the entire country to save your family's land, and you think you're not good at big speeches?" He blinked. "That," she said, "is the biggest speech I've ever seen anyone give." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Is that a yes?" He looked at her for a moment. She squeezed his hand. "That's a very big yes." The crowd, which had been collectively holding its breath in a way that 300 people and several camera crews can only barely manage, released it all at once. Roy Hutchins made a noise that could only be described as triumphant. Cal covered his face with his hat for a moment, entirely overwhelmed, which was very understandable. Jake looked at Sarah. Then he leaned down and kissed her, because he was not a man who, having decided on a direction, hesitated, and because 44 days was long enough to wait for most things. It was not a grand cinematic kiss so much as a quiet, certain one. The kind that says, "I have thought about this carefully and decided, and I am not going to change my mind." The kind that belongs to people who have told each other real things in evening light. The crowd managed to get even louder. Real things in evening. Estelle Pruitt, watching from the road where she'd brought an entire slow cooker of chili in the back of her truck, turned to Patty Okonkwo and said, "I told you." "You did," Patty agreed, already typing. "That is so much better than the shepherd story." "The shepherd story was very good. This is better." The bank appointment happened the next day, and the debt was settled with a combination of the GoFundMe, which had climbed to $460,000 by the time it was closed, and a payment plan for the remainder that the bank manager, who had also watched the television segment, agreed to with what might be described as unprecedented warmth. He shook Jake's hand for a long time. Unprecedented warmth. The ranch did not become a tourist destination exactly, though people drove past on County Road 14 for a long time afterward, and some of them left flowers at the spot where the tractor had been parked, which Jake considered deeply strange but did not remove because it seemed to mean something to people, and meaning something to people was not a thing to be dismissed. Roy Hutchins remained the unofficial community liaison of the Turner Ranch and continued to bring supplies, though his selection improved dramatically once Sarah had a gentle but firm conversation with him about nutritional variety. Cal Turner, who had shown up every single morning for 44 days, quietly, never asking for recognition, told exactly one person about the deal he'd made on Jake's behalf in week 2, when the debt situation had seemed most precarious, renegotiating a payment timeline with the bank that had bought them the critical weeks they needed. That one person was Jake, and the conversation consisted of Cal saying it and Jake being quiet for a very long time, and then saying Cal's name once in a tone that contained everything 40 years of brotherhood accumulates. Cal said, yeah, and punched him lightly on the shoulder, and that was that. The summer was warm and long and full in the way that summers are when something has shifted from worry to hope. Jake fixed the faucet in Sarah's kitchen in July, which took 45 minutes and involved exactly one trip back to the hardware store. She stood in the kitchen and watched him work and brought him iced tea and thought about how comfortable it was to have him in her space, how much she had not expected that. They went to dinner at an actual table, indoors, at a restaurant in Austin that Sarah had chosen because she had been waiting for 44 days, and she was going to make a reservation somewhere nice. Jake wore his good hat and a clean shirt, and looked exactly like himself, which was all she had ever wanted. He told her, that night over dinner, about the moment he'd made the promise. Not the version he'd told the Gazette. The real version. He'd been standing at the fundraiser looking at all those faces. Neighbors, friends, people whose families had farmed this land alongside his for generations. and he'd felt the particular despair of a man who has run out of conventional options. "And I thought," he said, "if I do something loud enough, something public enough, maybe the story does the work the bank accounts couldn't. Maybe people see it and think it matters, and maybe it gives me enough time to figure the rest out." "Was it terrifying?" she asked. "Absolutely." He looked at her across the table. "You were the part I didn't plan for." She smiled. "Was I a problem?" "No." He reached across the table, unhurried, and took her hand. "You were the reason it worked," unhurried, and took her. She thought about that for a moment. About the evenings on County Road 14, the conversations in the golden light, the slow and surprising process of someone becoming necessary to you. She thought about being the person someone waits for without knowing they're waiting. She thought about how she'd driven past that tractor for 7 days before she stopped, and how different everything would be if she hadn't. "I'm glad I brought the chicken and dumplings," she said. He smiled, really smiled, the smile that changed his face, the smile she'd been trying not to think about since the first time she saw it. "Best decision you ever made," he said. "Don't push it," she said. "I've made several excellent decisions." "Name one." "I came back the next night." "That's fair," he said. "That one was good." In Millbrook, Texas, the story was already becoming legend, the way small-town stories become legend, embellished with each retelling, polished with affection, passed from Estelle's diner counter to the back pews of First Baptist to the booths of the feed store, until the rough edges were worn smooth, and what remained was the essential truth of it. A man who loved his land enough to do something unreasonable, a woman who was kind enough to show up, and a town that had rallied around both of them because that was what towns were for. The tractor went back to working the fields of the Turner Ranch, which was what it had been built for. Jake Turner got off it at last and found that the ground was solid beneath him, and the land was his, and the woman beside him was real, and that was enough. That was, in fact, everything. On the last day of summer, standing at the edge of the east field at sunrise, because he still faced east in the mornings, the east field at sunrise, and always would, Jake Turner looked out at the land his great-grandfather had broken with a mule and a prayer, and felt something he hadn't felt in years. He felt like staying. Behind him, the house on the ridge was lit up in the morning light. Sarah was in the kitchen. He could see her through the window, moving around, early as always, making coffee, talking probably to herself because she did that. Narrated her mornings in a quiet running commentary that he'd come to love the way you come to love the particular music of a place you belong. He was going to marry her. He hadn't said so yet. He would, when the moment was right, which would probably be in the evening, in the field, because that was where everything between them had started, and starting places deserved to be honored. He turned toward the house. The hawk circled overhead, claiming the morning, as it always did. Jake Turner walked home. End.